Captain's log, stardate 86753099. The past 24 hours have been quite the ordeal for the Enterprise and her crew, as we just barely managed to escape the detection of a Klingon war vessel. The ship was also besieged by those adorable abominations, the Tribbles. We'll be scraping them out of the airlock for weeks to come. There was also a technical glitch with the ship's transporter which split me in two. And as of now, I'm still not sure which me I was at the time. But needless to say, today on the Enterprise was a Thursday. I've decided to take this moment of reprieve to review the contents of the captain's log from material on my new book. I call it James T. Kirk's Gone with the Wind. Perhaps the title could use some work. Spock suggested something along the lines of Star Trek. Bones suggested something similar, calling it Star Wars. But I don't see something as silly sounding as Star Wars being remotely successful. Oh, not in a million years. Hi, welcome to Rose Reads. I'm your host, Hunter Rose. And yes, I did say that correctly. This is going to be Rose Reads, as I'm actually covering Star Trek as a book and not a television show. I bet you're thinking you didn't realize that Star Trek was based on a book series. Well, it wasn't. What we have here is the novelization of the original show from 1966. So things are going to get a little weird, as most of what I do have to say can also apply to the show. And things may tend to get a little technical in my comparison of the two, so just brace yourself for that. Before we go forward, I would like to disclaim that this is not a storytime channel. So as far as fully fledged Star Trek stories are concerned, you're not going to get any from me. All I want to do is help you find out if a book's worth your time and your interest. Now, you should never judge a book by its cover, but let's take a look at the one I have and see if it's right for you. Now, what we have here is the Barnes & Noble Collectible edition of Star Trek. And what this really is an adaptation of the 3 seasons of the original series in book form. And I gotta say, this is the best looking book that I own, which is so ironic because it is a book based on Star Trek. But I just love the sleek and simplistic design. The gold accents really just pop out from the black background of space. And you got that iconic Federation logo on the front. You got this decorative spine, and the back is a top-down view of the Enterprise in that fantastic gold coloring. I know getting a book just because it looks nice is shallow, but whether you're a Star Trek fan or not, and you pick this up just because it looks so great, I wouldn't judge you in the slightest. And that is all I have to say about this thing. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. What's the matter? Usually when I say bye-bye, that means it's a wrap. Hey, don't look at me like that. When anything looks as good as that book does, what more do you really need to know? Am I right? Are you saying you won't be convinced until you actually hear about the content? Of all the times to be a cautious spender. All right, I'll talk. You don't have to twist my arm, you know. Let me start off by saying I really did have a blast with this book. I could barely put it down, but I will admit that I think I only enjoyed it as much as I did because I fell into a very specific set of circumstances. 1, I actually like reading. 2, I like science fiction. And 3, the most important one, I wasn't actually a Star Trek fan before I read this book. And I know that sounds ridiculous. Clearly, this is marketed towards fans of the franchise. So why did I end up with it? Well, it was because of those three reasons that I was hoping this would serve as an excellent introduction to the series. And luckily for me, I was right. I had a lot of fun with this. I was curious to see what the actual Star Trek community's reception of this was, and it turns out it's relatively negative. You see, I think a lot of fans had the impression that Star Trek would take advantage of the novelization to greater flesh out the stories in more detail and give us a clear, in-depth look in the thoughts and minds of these characters. And really, that's not the case. You see, when a book gets adapted to another form of media, heavy alteration needs to take place, as a book has hundreds of pages to tell its story, and a film only has a couple hours. The vice versa isn't true for adaptation. If a story originates on film, that story becomes set in stone. The best you can hope for in a novelization is maybe a cut scene that didn't make the final product, or a few extra bits of dialogue, none of which will impact or change the story in any meaningful way. So essentially, what you read here is going to be identical to what you'd see in the show. Well, it's not the whole truth. There is one singular story that is different from its on-screen counterpart. And that's a story from the tail end of season 1, The City on the Edge of Forever. The version we see in the book is an amalgamation of a scrapped original script for the episode and the one we see on the show, just kind of mashed together. But let's be fair, that's one story out of 3 seasons worth of content. That's not really going to be a deal maker or breaker for anybody. Now that we've gotten the pesky business of expectations out of the way, let's talk about how adaptation affects the writing. Now, when a book is written from the ground up, an author is doing many different things that serve many different purposes. An adaptation is less traditional. It's not like they just took the script for the show and then published it, but they did take the script and use it as a skeleton for the book. They throw in some sensory details so the story flows more coherently, and then bing, bang, boom, you got yourself a new book. So it's gonna feel like it lacks substance. It's like you trim the fat and all that's left is pure, refined entertainment. So if you want your books to be intellectually stimulating, you're gonna give all adaptations a pass. But if entertainment is what you're craving, then boy, you're in for a rush. All right, I think I've played English professor enough for one day. Here's something I've been waiting to say from the beginning of the video. Let's talk about Star Trek. I suppose it would be rude of me not to introduce you to the many good members of the crew here on the USS Enterprise, so let's start with the ship's fearless leader, Captain Kirk. Kirk serves as the man of action on the Enterprise, as he's always jumping into the fray and doing everything in his power to ensure the safety and well-being of his crew. And though he is a trooper, he's actually most well known for his charm, and giving the phrase "where no man's gone before" some new meanings. I know when most people think back on the character of Captain Kirk, they are likely to think about his way with women, but what really baffled me about this character is his way with machines. Now, AI and androids were nowhere near as commonplace in the original series, and the Borg hadn't even made the scene yet. But God forbid if Kirk ever did meet the Borg, they wouldn't stand a ghost of a chance. Let me elaborate. There's one episode where an entire civilization is being puppeteered by a massive thinking computer. Kirk leads it through a series of arguments where he tries to convince it the most logical thing for it to do is kill itself. And it does. I know it's paraphrasing, but Kirk just walked up to the computer, told it to kill itself, and it did. And that's not the end of it. In another episode, Kirk is taken captive by a female android. I can't recall if he knew she was an android at the time, but he tries seducing it and succeeds. I know if you watch this episode, you're probably not going to think anything of it. You're like, so he got along with the robot. Who cares? But just take a moment for that to really sink in. James T. Kirk, a living, breathing man, was able to physically attract a non-living mechanical organism. Clearly, Kirk's charisma has transcended to a plane far beyond the pitiful limitations of logic and science. Speaking of logic and science, let's talk about the ship's second in command, Spock. Spock is the science officer on the Enterprise, and by far one of the most iconic and interesting characters in the entire Star Trek franchise. You see, Spock is half Vulcan, and aside from having pointy ears, Vulcans are described to be creatures of pure logic and science, completely devoid of any and all feeling. I know that doesn't sound interesting. It makes him sound like a walking, talking calculator. But what's really neat is that there are rare occurrences throughout the series that contradict this, where Spock is allowed to express emotion. So you're not left with the impression that Spock is nothing more than a scientific sociopath completely devoid of feeling, but rather those emotions are always present, and that he really does value the time he's spent and the relationships formed on the Enterprise. He's just virtually incapable of showing it. It's these opposites and layers that really make Spock such a dynamic character and really the gold standard for this type of intellectual character. Now, let's talk about the third member of the crew, Dr. Bones McCoy. Bones is the residing medical professional on the Enterprise. And to be honest, he has a much greater role in the original series than I think I was expecting. When most people think the leads of the original, they'll think Kirk and Spock. But Bones is up there alongside the two. Kirk and Spock have polar opposite personalities, and Bones serves as the emotional anchor between the two, grounding them both to reality. He's not afraid to call Kirk out on his reckless behavior or to help Spock see how cold and indifferent he tends to be. And despite being the Enterprise's straight man, Bones really does have some of the most comedic bits of sarcasm in the entire series. So Kirk and Spock on their own is good. Kirk, Spock, and Bones is better. Kirk, Spock, and Bones really are the heart, mind, and soul of the Enterprise, and most of the heavy characterization is reserved for them. But they're not making this interstellar voyage alone. Accompanying them is Sulu, who runs navigation on the Enterprise, Chekhov, who's the chief of security, Arula, who handles communications, and a personal favorite of mine, Scotty, the chief of engineering. And of course, the many, many red shirts that bravely gave their lives so no one on the A-team had to. You will be missed. Being a product of the 60s, Star Trek sports a surprisingly diverse cast of characters. I mean, it's even got Vulcan representation. How many pieces of media did you see before Star Trek that included Vulcans? Zip. Jokes aside, this really was an ambitious move for them, but it's one I appreciate, as it serves to make the Enterprise feel like a smaller part of a larger united Earth Federation that set aside its own differences in pursuit of the exploration of this wider universe. Now that you've met the stars, let's talk about the Trek. Now, as actual plot is concerned, Star Trek doesn't really have one, at least not in an overarching sense. There's no end goal, no final destination, not even an evil overlord to dethrone. You see, the crew of the Enterprise set off with one goal in mind, and that's to charter the unexplored regions of space. So Star Trek was designed so that each episode, it didn't matter how many you've seen previously or even what order you've seen them in. Each one was meant to be its own individual self-contained adventure. And I know that doesn't sound as emotionally rewarding in the era of streaming, but look at it this way. Without being chained to a larger continuity, this afforded the writers a blank check on creativity. And by golly, they make full use of it. There is so much going on in Star Trek. You've got gangsters, evil doppelgangers, reptile men, psychics, gods, time travel, space battles. The list goes on and on. So many amazing ideas were allowed to flourish under Star Trek. Ideas that would go on to define science fiction for its time and influence it for years to come. Creativity is hands down Star Trek's greatest attribute. Does it have a weakest link? Well, there's one that I can think of, and it's only really a weakness if you perceive it as such, but Star Trek is campy. And I know when a lot of people hear the word campy, they tend to wince. But Your Honor, please let me speak on Star Trek's defense. It does adopt a light tone, but that doesn't mean none of the stories are dramatic and suspenseful. And the ones that are on the more amusing side, well, the humor is never done in a way that feels overbearing, idiotic, or even immature. It's just good fun. And so what if Star Trek doesn't want to show a dystopian future where everything's trashier than it is now? Star Trek dared to make you believe that limitless potential for adventure and discovery were just beyond our reach, past the stars. And someday, we will be good enough to reach every corner of that final frontier. I know the lines between book and film kind of blurred here, so let's circle back to that one last time before we settle things. Is there a superior version of these stories? Well, I can't honestly say because they're the same. The only thing that changes is the format. Saying one is greater is like walking up to a mirror and saying the reflection is better than you are. I will say if you choose the show, you're ultimately getting more, as you actually get to see the exotic creatures and locations and experience the delivery from the actors of these iconic roles. I will say that Star Trek is definitely a product of its time, and its age might be difficult to overlook. If you find it's a hurdle that you just can't get over, well, the book doesn't have that limitation. Your imagination is filling the blanks in the book. You can envision it exactly how it was in the show, or you can picture these stories being retold with the J.J. Abrams reboot cast. There's really no limit to how you can perceive these stories through the book. So which version is really going to be a matter of preference. But whether you choose to add the book to your wish list or add the show to your watch list, I will say that I don't believe the original crew of the Enterprise is likely to disappoint. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you willing to give the Star Trek book a shot? And if you're already experienced with anything from the Star Trek franchise, well, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, beam me up, Scotty. No, I know we're already on the Enterprise. I was just calling to say hello. And yes, I know no one actually says, beam me up, Scotty. I read the book word for word. Oh, come on, don't be mad. Oh. Sounds like we're gonna have to be landing the Enterprise for a while. Well, until the next video, live long and prosper.